At the height of World War II, as Japanese forces pushed relentlessly across Southeast Asia, few outside the highest ranks of British command knew of a radical idea taking shape in a dimly lit planning room in Delhi. It was February 1943, and Brigadier Ord Charles Wingate, the eccentric, intense, and relentlessly unconventional soldier, was crafting a mission unlike any the British Empire had attempted in the Burma campaign. His plan was simple in theory yet perilous in practice. Send a brigade deep behind Japanese lines, sever supply routes, and force the enemy to divert strength to chase a force that technically should not have survived long enough to matter. The 77th Indian Infantry Brigade, assembled for this purpose, was no ordinary formation. Comprised primarily of the 13th Battalion of the King's Royal Rifle Corps, the 3 of 2 ND Gurkha Rifles, the 2nd Battalion of the Burma Rifles, and supporting units, it would soon bear a name that echoed through Allied field reports: the Chindits. Wingate envisioned them not as traditional infantry but as long-range penetration groups, capable of infiltrating the dense Burmese jungle and living off supplies dropped from the sky. For many soldiers, the idea of relying solely on air supply and mule trains felt like an invitation to catastrophe. From the beginning, the men sensed that Operation Longcloth was something different. Officers were observed burning maps after studying them, a gesture that signaled to the troops how deep they were expected to travel into enemy territory. One rifleman later wrote in his diary, "Wingate said we would march where maps ended, and where rescue would not follow." It was not hyperbole. The Chindits would be moving nearly 200 miles into territory controlled by seasoned Japanese regiments, including the 18th Division, known for its brutal jungle discipline. The terrain, even on the Indian side of the frontier, foreshadowed what was to come. The Chindwin River snaked through wild, near-uninhabited land, and beyond it lay the mountains and thick teak forests of Burma. Imagery from reconnaissance flights provided only vague outlines. The canopy was too dense to reveal the jungle floor. Ground patrols reported that entire sections of forest swallowed sound, making it impossible to hear enemy movement, or the movement of one's own column, until it was too late. Yet Wingate's confidence remained unshakable. He stressed mobility, stealth, and confusion. The Chindits would not fight conventional battles. Instead, they would strike fast, destroy railroads, cut telegraph lines, sabotage bridges, vanishing before the Japanese could respond. "We are not here to hold ground," Wingate told his commanders. "We are here to make the ground itself uncertain." To many of the British and Indian troops, Wingate seemed a paradox. Part visionary, part fanatic. He walked barefoot around camp, quoting the Old Testament, yet his tactical theories were painstakingly detailed. He rejected armored support, insisting that speed and unpredictability were the brigade's greatest weapons. Even the choice of pack animals, over more robust mechanized support, revealed the uncompromising nature of the mission. Mules could travel silently, survive on minimal forage, and move where trucks could not, but they were also prone to panic under fire and vulnerable to disease. As preparations intensified, so did a sense of unease. Soldiers practiced river crossings by night, moving silently in single file, only the soft thud of mules' hooves breaking the quiet. They trained to break down and reassemble radios in minutes, to pack parachute-dropped supplies before the Japanese could target the drop zones, and to navigate by compass alone through moonless jungle. The Burma Rifles, experts in local languages and terrain, taught the others how to read faint footpaths and identify edible plants, knowledge that would soon prove critical. Journal entries from the period paint a picture of unpredictable morale. Some men felt invigorated by the daring nature of the mission. Others wrestled with the grim reality that if things went wrong, there would be no easy escape. Letters home were filled with vague promises and cautious optimism, carefully screened by censors who understood that even hints of the operation's existence could compromise it. By late February 1943, the stage was set. The Chindits began their approach toward the Chindwin River, the final threshold between relative safety and the Burmese interior. As they moved closer to the frontier, uncertainty tightened around them like the vines of the jungle they were about to enter. Each step forward meant abandoning established supply lines and stepping into a realm where the British Army had suffered repeated defeats. When the first units reached the riverbank, the water reflected the moonlight in a pale shimmer, cold, silent, and vast. This crossing marked the point of no return. Behind them lay India. Ahead lay one of the most unforgiving landscapes of the war. What none of them yet knew was how many of their comrades would vanish in the weeks to come, swallowed not just by the enemy but by the dense, mysterious jungle itself. Their long march was about to begin. The Chindits began their push across the Chindwin River on the night of February 14, 1943, an evening remembered by survivors as eerily calm, as if the jungle itself were holding its breath. The crossing marked the first irreversible commitment of Operation Longcloth. By dawn, more than 3,000 men and nearly 1,000 mules had slipped across the river in small rafts and improvised boats, leaving behind the comfort of established supply lines. Ahead lay the dense, humid interior of Japanese-occupied Burma, a region the British Army had failed to penetrate since the fall of Rangoon the previous year. The terrain immediately asserted its dominance. In some places, the undergrowth was so thick that a column could disappear after marching only a few paces. Soldiers described feeling as if the forest was swallowing them whole, trees towering overhead, humidity soaking through uniforms, and insects forming a constant, buzzing veil. The Chindits marched mostly in single file, relying on compasses and Burma Rifle scouts to navigate trails so faint they seemed carved by ghosts. The mules, though invaluable, struggled in the knee-deep mud and on narrow ridges, often panicking at the sudden cries of jungle birds that mimicked human whistles. The Japanese presence was felt almost immediately. Patrols from the 18th and 56th Divisions had intensified their reconnaissance, aware that something unusual was brewing on the frontier. Though they didn't yet know it was Wingate's long-range force, they sensed an intrusion. Within days of the crossing, the Chindits reported shadowing activity. Movement glimpsed between trees, footprints that mirrored their own routes, the faint metallic click of rifles being repositioned somewhere in the greenery. These were the opening moves of what would become a deadly, invisible chess match in the jungle. The first major disruption mission took place near the railway line between Myitkyina and Mandalay. Wingate split his brigade into several columns, each tasked with striking Japanese supply arteries. Column 5, under Lieutenant Colonel Bernard Ferguson, succeeded in demolishing a key section of the railway at Bonchong Gorge. The explosion echoed across the valley, sending tremors through the Japanese command network. British intelligence later recorded that the Japanese 18th Division dispatched multiple companies in response, an early sign that the Chindits' presence was being taken seriously. But success came at a price. The jungle, combined with enemy countermeasures, was proving relentless. In the aftermath of the Bonchong attack, Japanese patrols tightened the net around the dispersing columns. Reports from survivors indicate sudden gunfire erupting from seemingly empty forest corridors, prompting frantic breakouts and reassembly attempts. Several Chindit groups were separated during these clashes, forced to navigate alone through hostile terrain without reliable communication. Wireless sets, battered by humidity and near-constant use, began failing. Entire platoons lost contact with Wingate's headquarters. One Gurkha NCO wrote in his pocket diary, "We hear distant firing. We do not know whose it is. We march toward the sound, hoping it is friendly. The jungle plays tricks." Such moments amplified the tension already weighing on the men, tension born not only of combat, but of the unsettling feeling that the jungle itself was eroding their sense of direction and time. By mid-March, the Chindits faced a growing challenge. Their movements were being tracked more precisely. The Japanese, having deciphered some of Wingate's tactics, began blocking anticipated escape routes and predicting the column's next objectives. Small skirmishes escalated into full engagements as Japanese units ambushed crossing points near the Shweli River and along ridges leading toward the Irrawaddy Basin. The Chindits responded with hit-and-run tactics, using the forest as both shield and trap, striking fast and fading away before enemy reinforcements could close in. Yet a darker element crept into the Chindits' dispatches during this period: men and units that failed to reappear. Some were last seen entering ravine passes shrouded in morning mist. Others were separated during night movements when a single misstep could lose a column's faint trail. Eyewitnesses reported hearing scattered rifle shots deep in the forest long after contact had been lost with missing comrades. Whether these sounds marked last stands, desperate attempts to signal nearby units, or Japanese executions, no one could say. Their absence added a layer of mystery and quiet dread to the mission. Through it all, Wingate continued pushing his men forward, emphasizing that every mile they advanced forced the Japanese to divert resources. He believed deeply in the strategic value of pressure, constant, unpredictable, unrelenting. But increasingly, the operation felt like a race against time. Supplies were dwindling faster than anticipated, malarial mosquitoes swarmed relentlessly, and heat exhaustion struck men who marched under packs that felt heavier with each passing hour. Still, the Chindits pressed deeper into Burma, silently absorbing the jungle's hardships and the enemy's pursuit. Each successful sabotage shook Japanese confidence, but each day also added new unanswered questions. What happened to the missing platoons? Were they alive, hiding, or captured? And how long could a force operating on the very edge of survival continue without its cohesion beginning to fray? The answers would come in the weeks ahead, some clear, others lost entirely to the jungle shadows that waited deeper within Burma. By late March 1943, Operation Longcloth entered its most precarious phase. What had begun as a daring incursion was now a sprawling, fragmented operation where isolated Chindit columns maneuvered through some of the most unforgiving terrain in Burma. It was during this period that the mystery surrounding missing units began to deepen, quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, before accelerating into a pattern that unnerved even the most seasoned officers. The Japanese 18th Division, having realized that an Allied penetration force was operating in its rear areas, intensified its pursuit with a relentless efficiency characteristic of its jungle warfare doctrine. The Chindits' wireless communication sets, number 18 and number 38 radios modified for jungle use, were deteriorating rapidly under the relentless humidity. Moisture seeped into circuits, batteries drained unpredictably, and operators struggled to maintain contact long enough to coordinate movement. Entire messages were sometimes lost in static. When communication faltered, so too did the cohesion of the columns. Wingate had designed the operation with decentralization in mind, but the scale of separation that now unfolded was far beyond what he intended. Platoons became detached from companies, and companies from columns, like fragments of a map scattered in the undergrowth. One such instance occurred near the approaches to the Shuili River. In the early hours of March 21st, a platoon from Column 8, led by Captain Charles Holland, moved ahead to scout a potential crossing point. Dense morning mist blanketed the jungle floor, muting sound and visibility. When the main body arrived at the rendezvous point hours later, Holland's platoon was gone. No signs of struggle, no discarded kit, no tracks leading in any clear direction. Only a single mule, still saddled, wandered at the edge of the riverbank. A search patrol combed the area for nearly 2 days. Nothing was found. Survivors later recalled that the disappearance haunted them more deeply than open gunfire ever could. In one diary entry, a sergeant from the King's Royal Rifle Corps wrote, "It is one thing to lose men in battle. It is another to lose them to silence." To complicate matters, Japanese patrols were closing in from multiple directions, their boots leaving crisp, aggressive imprints in the mud. Footprints that suggested disciplined movement and coordinated pursuit. The Chindits knew the Japanese were comfortable fighting in the jungle, often operating without visible supply lines, using local resources and moving with uncanny speed. As the Japanese net tightened, Wingate issued new orders. Columns were to push eastward, deeper into Burma, to continue striking supply lines and rail hubs. To some officers, the command felt counterintuitive. Many believed the brigade should begin consolidating force and planning a westward withdrawal. But Wingate was adamant. Japanese radio intercepts suggested their commanders were confused about the Chindits' objectives, and Wingate believed pressing deeper would amplify this uncertainty. Yet, this decision meant plunging into increasingly unknown terrain. Steep ravines, high ridges covered in thick bamboo, and river valleys fed by early monsoon rains. Japanese companies began staging ambushes along likely routes, using tactics learned during the Malayan and Singapore campaigns, funneling enemy forces into killing zones, cutting off retreat paths, and employing snipers hidden in treetops. The Chindits adapted, fighting their way out of encirclement with hit-and-run flanking maneuvers. But the strain of constant movement and sudden attacks made it easier for units to become separated. Night marches, once a tactical advantage, now became a liability. The jungle's darkness was absolute, broken only by tiny flickers of luminous fungi on fallen logs and the occasional glow of cigarette embers, dangerous beacons that officers repeatedly forbade. The disappearance of smaller detachments continued. On March 27, a Gurkha section attempting to bypass a blocked trail near Longcloth vanished after a brief firefight. 2 rifle shots were heard, then silence again. When a reconnaissance group investigated the next morning, they found abandoned ration tins, a broken cookery, and traces of blood, but no bodies. Whether the men were killed, captured, or had attempted to flee into the forest remained unanswered. By early April, the cumulative effects of exhaustion, hunger, and uncertainty were beginning to register in the Chindit ranks. Rations were dangerously low, and resupply drops were increasingly difficult as Japanese units began targeting known drop zones. Some columns watched as aircraft circled overhead unable to release supplies due to enemy fire, leaving men with nothing but what they could forage. Wingate's promise that the air would sustain them was becoming harder to maintain. Despite this, the Chindits accomplished significant disruptions. They blew up stretches of the Mandalay-Myitkyina Railway, severed telegraph lines, and forced Japanese battalions to divert from frontline operations. But every mile gained added questions that weighed on the brigade. How many units had been lost? Were they still maneuvering somewhere out there? Or were they already prisoners along routes no Allied scout had yet traced? As April unfolded, these questions gnawed at commanders and rank-and-file soldiers alike. The jungle no longer felt merely hostile. It felt watchful. Each disappearance, each abandoned trail, each broken fragment of equipment recovered from the undergrowth fed a quiet dread that the greatest danger the Chindits faced was not the Japanese alone, but the possibility of simply vanishing without a trace. And deeper still awaited challenges that would push the brigade to the limits of endurance, and force Wingate to reconsider the direction of the entire operation. By early April 1943, the Chindits were at a crossroads, both literally and strategically. The Japanese pursuit had become so aggressive, so coordinated, that Wingate realized continuing westward risked total annihilation. In a decision that would shock many of his officers, he ordered the brigade to turn east, deeper into enemy territory, farther from India, and into landscapes scarcely surveyed even by colonial administrators. The logic was bold. The Japanese expected the Chindits to retreat. Moving east would give the scattered columns a better chance to evade encirclement. But it also meant embarking on a march through some of the most brutal terrain in Burma. The order was relayed to the columns through exhausted runners and fading wireless transmissions. For many men, hungry, worn down by weeks of continuous marching, the command felt like a plunge into the unknown. One lieutenant later recalled, "It was as if we had been asked to walk off the map entirely." Yet there was little alternative. Japanese units were pressing from the west and south. Reports from scouts indicated fresh enemy positions along expected withdrawal routes. Staying meant being trapped. Moving meant risking isolation but maintaining initiative. The geography ahead was unforgiving. The Chindits now faced the great north-south ridgelines that carved the Burmese interior, with valleys so steep that mules had to be unloaded and coaxed uphill in stages. Bamboo forests grew in such density that progress slowed to little more than a mile per hour. Rainstorms, early precursors of the monsoon, swept through without warning, turning slopes into slick chutes of mud. Rivers surged within hours, transforming shallow fords into torrents capable of sweeping away entire patrols. Many men later said the landscape itself felt predatory. Column separation increased dramatically during this phase. Some units lost contact for up to 5 days. The Burma Rifles guides did their best to track faint trails, but even they struggled to navigate the ever-shifting riverbanks and landslide-prone ridges. A diary entry from a medical officer of the 13th King's Royal Rifle Corps captured the strain. "We carry the wounded on bamboo stretchers. Each step is a negotiation with gravity. Some men fall, rise, and fall again. The jungle swallows the sound." The Japanese were not far behind. Field intelligence reports indicated that elements of the 3rd Battalion, 55th Infantry Regiment, had been rerouted to cut off the Chindits from the east. These troops, veterans of the Malayan campaign, knew the jungle intimately. Their tactics were precise: ambush at choke points, target mules first, and force the British into predictable retreats. The Chindits responded with equal ferocity, executing sudden assaults to break through encirclements, using grenades and automatic fire to punch temporary gaps in the tightening Japanese lines. It was during these chaotic movements that more Chindit detachments went missing. One of the most puzzling cases occurred on April 9th near the Mu River Valley. A section from Column 5, tasked with clearing a bypass route, was heard engaging in a short, sharp firefight. When the main column arrived minutes later, the area was deserted. Spent cartridges littered the ground, and 2 blood-soaked bandages indicated casualties, but the men themselves were gone. Whether they were captured alive, dragged away, or had attempted to flee into the jungle, no trace was ever found. For the troops who discovered the site, the absence was more unsettling than the presence of bodies. Wingate, aware that cohesion was slipping, attempted to consolidate some units at makeshift rendezvous points. But the terrain and enemy pressure made large-scale regrouping nearly impossible. As ammunition dwindled, the Chindits were forced to choose engagements carefully. They conserved rifle rounds, increasingly relying on surprise, stealth, and movement rather than sustained firefights. Entire columns operated in silence, communicating through hand signals or brief whispered messages. The Chindits were now deep enough into Burma that even the Japanese underestimated how far they had penetrated. This created moments of unexpected advantage. In one instance near Nongmi, a Chindit unit stumbled upon a lightly defended supply camp, capturing rice, canned fish, and medical materials. But these small victories were exceptions. Glimpses of enemy strength grew more frequent. Fresh entrenchments, abandoned ration sacks marked with Japanese characters, and unfamiliar boot prints along riverbanks. The men knew they were moving through territory the enemy considered secure, territory from which prisoners rarely returned. Physical exhaustion became a constant companion. Feet swollen from trench foot, uniforms soaked for days, and persistent bouts of malaria weakened even the fittest men. Pack animals collapsed and were left behind. Some mules were quietly shot to prevent their braying from betraying the column's positions. Officers noted the toll on morale. Men rarely spoke unless necessary, conserving energy and emotion alike. Still, there were rare moments of perspective. A sergeant in the Gurkhas later recalled watching fireflies drift above the river one night, illuminating the water like stars reflected on its surface. It reminded us, he wrote, that the world outside the war still existed, even if we were marching further from it with each step. By the 3rd week of April, Wingate's gamble had bought the Chindits time, but at enormous cost. The Eastern March had pulled them temporarily out of the Japanese tightening net, yet had also thrust them into deeper isolation. Supplies were nearly gone. Columns were scattered. And somewhere in the jungle behind them were the unanswered mysteries of the men who had vanished. Ahead lay a dire choice: attempt extraction through risky airlifts, or continue marching toward China, a route with even less certainty. The greatest trials of Operation Longcloth were yet to come. By late April 1943, the Chindits were moving through Burma in a state that one officer later described as a brigade held together by willpower alone. Starvation, disease, and relentless pursuit had transformed the operation from a bold strategic experiment into a fight for survival. Rations were down to scraps, handfuls of rice, half-spoiled tinned meat, whatever the men could forage from the jungle floor. Many soldiers were weakened by malaria or dysentery, marching by instinct more than strength. Yet even in this deteriorating state, they continued to carry out sabotage missions, slipping through Japanese patrol lines to strike rail networks and supply dumps before fading back into the trees. The promised lifeline of air support, Wingate's crucial innovation, now hung by a thread. Japanese forces, having tracked the patterns of resupply, began targeting drop zones with increased accuracy. Zero fighters from nearby airfields patrolled the skies, turning attempted airlifts into dangerous gambles. Pilots of the Royal Indian Air Force and American 10th Air Force risked their lives flying low over the jungle to find clearings large enough to drop supplies. But more than once, Chindit units watched helplessly as aircraft circled overhead, unable to release cargo due to enemy fire or thick canopy, before banking away with their supplies still on board. One unsuccessful drop near the WWII Valley left a lasting impression. A Dakota transport plane attempted a low pass as Chindits lit signal panels arranged in a coded pattern. Moments later, the valley erupted with Japanese machine gun fire. The Dakota pulled up sharply, leaving the ground crew scrambling into the underbrush. No supplies were delivered. The men on the ground counted the incident as a sign. The Japanese were learning their methods, and the sky was no longer a guarantee of salvation. This scarcity magnified the tension among the columns. Water sources, once abundant, became contested as the dry season intensified. Some men risked drinking from stagnant pools, knowing the parasites within could be deadly. A medical officer's diary entry captured the grim reality. We choose between thirst and disease. Many choose disease. Despite these hardships, the Chindits continued their mission. Near Indore, a small detachment infiltrated a Japanese communications post and destroyed key telegraph lines. The explosion reverberated across the valley, momentarily lifting spirits. Yet even as the men celebrated, they noticed something unnerving. Faint columns of smoke rising from the tree miles away. Signals, perhaps, but from whom? Some believed they were from missing Chindit platoons trying to communicate their position. Others suspected Japanese deception tactics. With no reliable wireless contact, the question lingered without resolution. Missing units remained a haunting concern. As columns attempted to move toward prearranged rendezvous points, they encountered signs of previous encampments, ashes from campfires, discarded ration tins, but no soldiers. It was as if the jungle had quietly swallowed portions of Wingate's brigade. One Burmese rifleman told his commander he had found boot prints leading toward a riverbank, followed by a sudden break in the soil that suggested men had slid into the current. The river's depth and speed meant any bodies would be carried far downstream, unrecoverable. Fear of capture added another layer of dread. Japanese forces were known to interrogate prisoners harshly, and news spread among Chindit ranks of enemy patrols moving silently at night, marking trails with signs visible only by moonlight. Men began sleeping in shorter shifts, rotating watch positions and setting tripwires made from vines and tin cans. Exhaustion took its toll. Some soldiers reported hallucinations, shadows shifting into figures, whispers mistaken for voices. Yet the jungle, indifferent to their suffering, offered no respite. In this darkness, acts of remarkable resilience emerged. When a Gurkha rifleman collapsed from fever and dehydration, 2 comrades carried him for miles on an improvised stretcher until an evacuation attempt could be arranged. When a mule column ran out of fodder, men shared their dwindling rations with the animals, believing that losing the mules meant losing their remaining supplies entirely. The first significant evacuation attempt came near a clearing designated Broadway East, a rudimentary field hacked from the jungle by exhausted hands. The plan was simple: light signal fires, mark the perimeter with colored panels, and guide small aircraft in under the cover of dusk. But Japanese patrols had begun probing the area. The first plane managed to land, its wheels catching briefly on uneven ground before settling. The pilot signaled for wounded men to board quickly. As stretcher teams rushed forward, tracer rounds sliced through the treetops. The plane took off in a desperate climb, leaving wounded still on the ground. Subsequent attempts were abandoned. The Japanese had triangulated the site. These close calls fed the growing uncertainty between the columns. At night, distant signal fires flickered across valley ridges. Some Chindits swore the patterns resembled coded Allied signals. Others insisted they were Japanese lures designed to trap desperate men seeking rescue. The ambiguity became its own enemy. By late April, the men faced a stark truth. Many would never reach an extraction point. The operation's cost was becoming brutally evident. Still they marched, south, east, north, wherever Wingate's orders or survival instinct directed them, determined to find a path out of Burma. But the jungle held more challenges ahead, and the window for rescue was closing fast. The final stage of Operation Longcloth was approaching, a phase that would determine who lived, who vanished, and how history would remember this extraordinary mission. By early May 1943, Operation Longcloth had entered its final, most desperate phase. What remained of the Chindit columns were scattered across hundreds of miles of hostile terrain, some moving north toward the Chinese border, others attempting a hazardous return west toward India. The original strength of more than 3,000 men had been reduced by disease, starvation, ambush, and the unforgiving jungle. Yet even now, Wingate's force continued to pose a lingering strategic threat. Japanese commanders, unsettled by the persistence of an enemy they had expected to annihilate weeks earlier, allocated entire battalions to track down the remaining British units. The psychological impact of the Chindits, more than their material damage, unnerved the Japanese high command. Extraction was both a hope and a gamble. Air evacuation, the most viable rescue method, required clearings large enough for light aircraft or gliders, rare commodities in the dense Burmese interior. The American 1st Air Commando Group, still testing its capabilities, attempted several landings. Some were successful. Many were not. For many Chindit survivors, the sight of a small aircraft descending through a break in the canopy offered a moment of indescribable relief, only for the moment to collapse when Japanese patrols opened fire or the ground proved too uneven for landing. One such attempt occurred near the Tongsan Plateau. A team of engineers and riflemen cleared a makeshift strip using machetes and explosives, carving a narrow ribbon of ground through towering grass and bamboo. As the first light plane touched down, its wheels struck a hidden root, sending it lurching sideways. The pilot recovered control but radioed immediately. Unsuitable. Unsafe. The message was short. Final. The plane took off empty, leaving the wounded behind. Those present later recalled the silence that followed, the realization that rescue would not come, at least not that day. For other columns, the only option was to march out of Burma. This meant crossing swollen rivers, evading Japanese patrol lines, and navigating terrain known only to local guides. The monsoon had begun in earnest, turning every valley into a swamp and every ridge into a slick granite slide. Rain fell in sheets, reducing visibility to mere feet. Some men marched barefoot, their boots long since rotted away. Officers described a strange phenomenon, troops marching in near silence, too exhausted even to curse the weather or the war. It was during this harrowing retreat that more mysteries emerged. As units moved toward prearranged exit routes, they found signs of previous Chindit presence, ashes of long-dead fires, cut vines marking trails, the faint imprint of hobnailed boots, but no men. A patrol from Column 3 reported finding a hastily abandoned lean-to containing 3 water bottles, a broken rifle bolt, and a torn map fragment labeled only with the hand-drawn initials H. It matched the initials of a missing officer from Column 8, Captain Charles Holland, whose platoon had vanished weeks earlier. Whether the shelter marked a temporary refuge or the last stand of a dying patrol was never determined. Japanese pressure did not ease. As defeated Allied armies elsewhere retreated toward India, Japanese command feared that allowing any portion of Wingate's force to escape would embolden Allied long-range penetration doctrine. Patrols were ordered to press relentlessly, and survivors later recounted hearing Japanese voices in the night, sometimes close enough to discern commands, other times echoing faintly across riverbanks. In one incident near the WWII River, a Chindit section hid beneath thick reeds for nearly 12 hours as a Japanese search party combed the bank above them. The men stayed silent, even as leeches crawled across their skin and insects swarmed their faces. When the patrol finally moved on, one Chindit whispered, "We came within inches of ending the operation right there." Despite these dangers, some extractions succeeded. Near Toro, a group of severely wounded Chindits was evacuated by a daring flight under monsoon clouds. The pilot landed on a mud-slick strip at dusk, loading as many casualties as the plane could support. As the aircraft took off, its wheels flung mud in every direction, and Japanese rifle fire crackled from the tree line. One of the wounded later recalled seeing the jungle receding beneath them and realizing that, for the first time in months, he was leaving a place where death felt almost certain. But not all were so fortunate. Some units, especially those pushed far east, attempted to march toward China. Many never arrived. Chinese nationalist forces reported isolated encounters with exhausted British soldiers who staggered into outposts with little memory of the preceding days. But several other expected groups never materialized at any Chinese checkpoint. Their disappearance remains one of the enduring questions of Operation Longcloth. By June, the remnants of the operation reached India in small, broken groups, skeleton-thin, fevered, and hollow-eyed. In total, roughly one-third of the brigade never returned. Wingate himself survived, intent on refining his long-range penetration techniques for future operations. But even he acknowledged that parts of the mission would remain shrouded in uncertainty. For historians, the legacy of Operation Longcloth is a blend of innovation, resilience, sacrifice, and unresolved mystery. The operation shook the Japanese command structure and demonstrated that deep penetration warfare could be effective. Yet the unanswered questions, the vanished platoons, the abandoned shelters, the quiet gunshots deep in the forest, lingered long after the survivors limped home. And so the operation ended not with a triumphant march, but with a haunting echo, a reminder that the Burmese jungle, like war itself, keeps some secrets forever.